Yes. Okay. So, hi everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this insightful talk today. We have the privilege of hosting a truly exceptional scholar, Elouise, an expert in different fields, especially statistics, positive psychology, emotions, individual differences, and so on, who will guide us through a topic of great importance, which is the effect sizes. Yes. So before introducing our distinguished speaker, I'd like to take a moment to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the members of the research method SIG, Giuseppe, Bianca, and Alfaf for this amazing hard work and unwavering support to make the SIG a success. Well, for those who don't know Elouise, she is a postdoctoral research scientist in the Cognitive Science and Assessment Institute at the University of Luxembourg. She is an interdisciplinary researcher examining the role of individual differences in language learning, using concepts from both psychology, applied linguistics in her work. She has published widely on individual differences in foreign language learning with a focus on emotions, personality, and quantitative research methods. She was recently awarded with the Early Career Researcher Award from the International Association for the Psychology of Language Learning. Just a quick note, if you have any questions, please hold them until the end of the talk. Yes, Elouise, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Rocky. That was a very kind introduction. It made me blush. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and then start. Let's just make sure everything is fine. Okay, everyone can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Brilliant. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is a study that we have currently under review, and a little bit about effect sizes broadly, but I'm specifically going to talk about this study because I think it illustrates the need for effect sizes quite well. And the study, the preprint is out, and I did it along with Pia Resnick, who is also in the audience, and Lisa Stempfer from the University of Vienna. So if you have any questions that I can't answer, I'm just going to point to them and be like, okay, it's now their problem. So the aim of this study was to develop effect size guidelines for individual differences in L2 learning. Now, in order to do that, we need to understand A, what we mean with individual differences, and B, what we mean with effect size guidelines, because the majority of people would tell you, but effect size guidelines already exist. Why is there a need for you to develop more of them? So as a literature overview, individual differences originated in differential psychology and quickly spread towards other fields. And I think it's now quite an integral part of L2 learning research. And it is where researchers attempt to predict behavior via individual traits, attributes, and abilities. So within the L2 context, we specifically mean then that it is how individuals differ in terms of their traits, their skills, their aptitudes, in learning and speaking and integrating into different L2 contexts. So the reason why we have to look at individual differences specifically and the effect sizes of them is because of the massive increase in popularity in individual differences. And we can see that it's illustrated by the amount of citations for foreign language anxiety and for the amount of mentions of it in Google Scholar. So the word foreign language anxiety, if you just search for that on Google Scholar and you limit it by the specific amount of years, you can see that there is a massive increase from pre-2010 towards last year in 2024. With every year, there's increasingly more articles published in comparison to the previous years. And if you take the amount of articles published by 2010 and the amount of articles published in 2024, I mean, that's a massive, massive increase. So there's clearly an interest in the field in these topics. And it's the same if you look at the Horwitz and Cope paper from 1986, which can be seen as the seminal paper in foreign language anxiety, for example, and we look at the citations there, the amount of citations year on year increases to such an extent that it is time for us to take a step back and look at, okay, how are we interpreting the things in our field? How are we, for example, looking at our methodologies? And that's where people like Abdullah Alamer or Luke Plonsky comes in and talks about the quality of our methods. Because the field is now so large, it is time for us to make sure that what we're doing is of a higher quality. So, sorry for that little preachy part, but okay. Then in terms of individual differences in this paper, we categorized it according to the taxonomy of Lee and then also incorporated the taxonomy of Condon, because there are a lot of different taxonomies of how you can categorize individual differences. And we selected quite a broad one. So we categorize individual differences based on cognitive, conative, affective, and personality differences, which I'll go into each one separately. So the cognitive differences that we find is in terms of language aptitude, for example. So do you have a specific aptitude to learn languages? Language awareness, which are things like your phonological awareness, metalinguistic awareness. Then metacognition, so your understanding of your own cognitive processes. And then working memory, so to what extent can you hold a certain amount of information in your mind, which is, of course, critical when it comes to language learning and remembering language rules. Then we have conative differences, and conative actually just means motivational. So in L2, we have, of course, the L2 motivational system from Donye, which dominates the motivation area. Then we have things like self-efficacy, self-beliefs, language mindsets, etc. that also forms part of it. Then we also placed willingness to communicate under conative differences. People can argue differently about it. For us, because it has such a strong relationship with motivation and can also be seen as a motivational process, we put it under conative differences, but this can be criticized, and I'm fully open and aware of that. Then in terms of affective differences, it is the variables that lie quite closely to my heart because it's most of my research is about these differences. So it's things like foreign language anxiety and foreign language enjoyment. So our emotions, and then of course, foreign language boredom, which has become more and more popular. And then here we also placed emotional intelligence as an affective difference. Then personality differences in language learning. Oh, hi, Jean-Marc. Personality differences in language learning, we of course take the big five. So openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Other personality differences have been used in L2, especially the multilingual one. So the international, your attitude towards international people, etc. That can also be incorporated. But to be fair, in terms of the meta-analysis, which we will come to later, those have not been used in a meta-analysis before. So we stick to the big five. Okay. Now that we know what individual differences are and how we categorize them, we have to talk about effect sizes and why effect sizes matter. So effect sizes are the relationship between a predictor and an outcome variable, or in the case of a correlation, the relationship between two variables. And when it comes to actual prediction, it is the degree to which one variable can be predicted by another. For many people, effect sizes are something that you report alongside the p-value. But when it comes to you actually making an interpretation of your data, you focus on the p-value, because the p-value easily tells you if something is significant or not significant. And you can just run with that and say this was not significant, and in your discussion section, you just say not significant. But our argument is that effect sizes should have that same level of interpretation and reporting that the p-value currently does in applied linguistics, because your p-value is very dependent on things like your sample size. So when it comes to the p-value, you do reach a point where something can be too good to fail, so too big to fail. If you have absolute massive data sets, and you run a simple correlation or a simple regression, it can reach a point where your sample size is so large that it doesn't matter what you run, it will be significant. And that is where the effect size comes into play. And that is why we are very strongly advocating for effect sizes. But then when we say, okay, you have to interpret the effect size the same way you interpret the p-value. So the p-value, we have a simple, significant or insignificant, even though that is very arbitrary, and we can also talk about that for a long time. When it comes to the effect size, how do we interpret it? How do we say something is a large effect size, a small effect size, a medium effect size? And how do we compare effect sizes across papers to know where we fit in, obviously? So there are tons of existing effect size guidelines. So I have a list. This is a non-exhaustive list. But our argument in our paper, and my argument today, is that we do not have effect sizes and effect size guidelines that are applicable to L2 individual differences. So let me demonstrate. So we have the Cohen effect sizes, which are by far the most famous effect sizes. And most of the time, everyone just refers to Cohen. And he said small, 0.10, medium, 0.30, and large, 0.50. And when we looked at the existing effect size guidelines, we categorized them according to 3 categories. So we asked, is the effect size guideline empirically derived? So did the researcher, to some extent, go to the effort of analyzing the effect sizes in the field, analyzing variance explained, etc., to determine if an effect size should be determined as small, medium, or large? Then we had a look at, is this effect size individual difference specific? The reason why we want to look at individual difference specific effect sizes is because research has consistently showed that effect sizes in individual differences research are considerably smaller than effect sizes in other fields. So our field, we have to be aware of the fact that our effect sizes are smaller, but just because our effect sizes are smaller in comparison to another field does not mean that field specifically it is a small effect size. So we have to interpret within the context of our field. And then lastly, we also had a look at, is the effect size guideline L2 specific? And we wanted to see is there any effect size guideline that meets these requirements? And spoiler alert, there is none. So if we have a look at, for example, Cohen was not empirically derived. It is not individual difference specific, and it's of course not L2 specific. And you have others in the field of psychology. So for example, Hemphill, who has empirically derived effect size guidelines, but it is not individual differences specific, and it's not L2 specific. Then we have Ginac and César, which we took inspiration from for our paper. So we used the methods that they used to develop it for our field, because Ginac and César did use empirically derived methods to get their effect sizes, and it is specifically individual differences specific. So what they also showed in their paper is that individual differences in the field of psychology is considerably smaller than other fields. And that is why we say we have to consider the individual differences context. And then, of course, we have the effect sizes by Plonsky and Oswald, which was empirically derived and which is L2 specific, but it is not individual differences specific. So if we combine the fact that Ginac and César said individual differences have smaller effect sizes and should be considered separately, and Plonsky and Oswald said, okay, the effect sizes in L2 is specific and unique to the context, then we need to combine this into effect size guidelines that are L2 specific and individual differences specific. Because to illustrate it, at the moment, if I find an effect size, a correlation coefficient, of foreign language enjoyment predicting the grades in a class, and the size of my correlation is a 0.3. At the moment, if I use any of these guidelines, I will get a different conclusion, because if I use Cohen for a 0.3, it's a medium. If I use Funder and Ozer, it's a large. If I use Plonsky and Oswald, it's a small. If I use Ginac and César, it's large. So how do you interpret your effect sizes given all of this information? It's not possible, Because what the majority of researchers are then going to do is say, okay, great, Junak and Zizodorei says my effect size is large. I'm just going to do that because that sounds better. But is it an actual reflection of what is going on in the field? Not necessarily. So this is where we come in with our methodology. What we did is we followed the methods of Junak and Zizodorei, and we did a second order synthesis. So we did a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So a meta-analysis. And we used PsycInfo, ERIC, APA, Psych Articles, Web of Science, ProQuest, and Scopus. And we tried to find every single meta-analysis that has been published in the field of language learning. We found 1,101 studies. And of that, obviously, we excluded everything that wasn't applicable. A lot of them we excluded because, oh, yes, and then also to get back, in terms of which ones we included, it had to be a meta-analysis that looked at an individual difference as a predictor of language learning. And language learning could be academic proficiency, it could be grades, tests, it could also be a proficiency test, as long as the outcome was something to do with actually gaining proficiency in the language, but it could also be a proxy variable. So that's also a limitation that I'll get to. Okay, so from there we had a look, and finally we had 23 meta-analyses. There were more that we could have included, but unfortunately those did not have the necessary information, so the correlation coefficients were not reported, and the authors did not have them available, or we couldn't get into contact with the authors. So there are a few more, but we couldn't include them. So in the end, we had 23 meta-analyses in the field. Of those 23 meta-analyses, we had 1,719 effect sizes. So for each meta-analysis, we basically coded all of the effect sizes and categorized them according to our taxonomy of individual differences. So we had cognitive differences, personality differences, cognitive differences, and affective differences. And then, as I previously discussed, we had within each of these different categories. But in order to do the effect size guidelines, we have to go quite broadly. So we stuck to these 4 categories. Okay. Then what we did is we looked at all of the effect sizes, always as a correlation coefficient. And we calculated the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile of these effect sizes, because that, in essence, will be the smaller, medium, and larger effect sizes found across the field. And from that, we used those percentiles to calculate small, medium, and large effect sizes, or to give a recommendation for what they should be. Here, I just want to point out, because this is the density plots of everything. So for personality, please note that it is quite skew. And then for affective, we see a little bit of a bimodal distribution, but for cognitive, we definitely see a bimodal distribution. So that is something to keep in mind. Okay, then when it comes to all of the effect sizes, everything together, so not categorized according to our 4 categories, we found the 25th percentile to be a 0.21, 50th percentile to be a 0.36, and the 75th percentile to be a 0.53. So most of you, or some of you, might have spotted that this is already quite similar to actually Cohen's guidelines from 1988. So it might be that the first guy who suggested guidelines was correct for our field, but our smaller one is a little bit larger than what he suggested. But okay. But what I also want to point out is that with these effect sizes, if you look at the variance explained, it is still quite small. So we have to be aware that even if we say something is a large effect size, etc., in our field, the amount of variance explained is not necessarily so large. So if you go into different fields like mechanical learning or things like that, they expect massive effect sizes. But in our field, it is way, way smaller. So let me demonstrate it. Marky has already seen this, but for a talk in Istanbul, I basically tried to explain variance explained with this picture. It's a heavy oversimplification, but I think it is a nice way to demonstrate it. So if you take this picture of Istanbul and you say, okay, in variance explained, we try to paint in a picture, right? We try to understand what is going on in this individual and the amount of variance explained in this outcome variable. A 4.4% variance explained is this amount in a picture. And I don't know about you, but I cannot make any proper conclusions about the picture as a whole based on this little dot. And when it comes to the 50th percentile, we have almost 13% variance explained. This is what it looks like. So you can make more conclusions. You can say, okay, that looks like a mosque to me, or it looks to me like a sunny country, etc. But you cannot make a lot of conclusions. And when it comes to the 75th percentile, which is of course only our upper 25th will be like this and more, you do see quite a bit more. But again, this is not going to be what the average study looks like in our field in terms of variance explained. So that's also just something to keep in mind with the effect sizes, is that you also need to convert the effect sizes into the amount of variance explained. Okay, so for all of our results, we basically found these percentiles. So what I want to point out quickly is that for cognitive, we seem to have a lot larger effect sizes than any of the other categories. So when it comes to things like motivation, self-beliefs, etc., it seems to be that our effect sizes are quite a bit larger. And then when it comes to personality, our effect sizes are quite a bit smaller. So it is possible for you to use the overall effect size guideline if needed, but we have to be cognizant that within these different categories of individual differences, we find quite a lot of difference between the different categories. So based on those, we developed these effect size guidelines. So we have an overall one of 0.2, 0.35, and 0.5. And then we have the differences. So cognitive and affective is quite similar, but cognitive is, again, much larger and personality much smaller. So yeah, you kind of have to keep in mind what variables you're working with, but we'll get to that. Okay. But a different thing to also consider is publication bias, because publication bias occurs when people find findings that goes against the grain or that have null results, and then they have trouble publishing this, or they decide not to even try at all because it goes against the grain of research. And it is then called the file drawer effect, where you just put those non-significant results in a file somewhere and you forget about it. And because those are not captured then in actual journal articles, when someone does a meta-analysis, these null effects, smaller effects, negative effects are not captured in the meta-analysis. And we have a consistent overestimation of effect sizes in meta-analysis. So for us doing a meta-analysis, obviously, all of these problems in publication biases found in the meta-analysis at the first order is confounded to the second order. So it's just become worse. And of course, this is going to affect the way we look at effect sizes. So this is a severe limitation of this method of determining effect size guidelines. So what we did to try to see if this is possible, or if this is present, is we had a look at the meta-analyses and how the authors described the publication bias found. Of course, there's loads of different methods of calculating publication bias, so it was not possible to compare it on a study-to-study basis. But we had a look at the language that the researchers used, and we categorized it as saying there was no bias found, there was minimal bias, some concerns, or definitely the presence of bias. And then from there, we calculated just a simple ANOVA to see, okay, if the different effect sizes categorized as no bias versus some bias versus definitely bias, is there a significant difference? And there was. So if we have a look at the effect sizes categorized in meta-analyses with no bias versus the effect sizes of meta-analyses with some bias or definite bias presence, you can see that there is quite the difference in effect size. So the more bias, the larger our effect sizes. We don't know how to take this into account necessarily, but it is a very large caveat that has to be considered. Okay, so that was our effect size guidelines. And then, especially for today's discussion, I want to talk about the advice or talking points that we raised in our article that I think is important and should be kept in mind, and is something that we might be able to discuss later on. So the first thing that we emphasize is that effect sizes must be reported and interpreted. It was not long ago that there was the paper by Wei et al., and they basically had a look at if effect size, the reporting of effect sizes are mandatory in L2 journals. And they found that the vast majority of journals that they had a look at did not have mandatory reporting of effect sizes in the journal policies. So it is not necessarily that you have to report it. I mean, my hope is that a reviewer will say, listen, you need to report it. But it is also possible that someone can get away with only reporting p-values, or at least only interpreting p-values. And this has to change. We have to have a shift, and I mean, this also very strongly links to the methodology reform that Luke talks about a lot, that we have to interpret the effect sizes alongside the p-values. And then, of course, due to the differences in the effect size distributions found across the 4 categories, we also have to be very cognizant of the way we interpret the effect sizes. Because if you are looking at a study that uses personality as a predictor, you're going to interpret it considerably differently than a study where you are looking at motivation or language aptitude. Okay, then also what has to be emphasized is effect size guidelines remain subjective. So I quite like the quote that says, it is a qualitative interpretation of a quantitative value. Because yes, we followed a previously established methodology to derive these effect size guidelines. Yes, we try to remain objective, but there is always subjectivity in effect size interpretation. And it 100% depends on whose guidelines you use, how you classify things, how you're going to look at it. And even in our interpretation, for example, how would you classify something like grit? Is grit going to be a quantitative value for you? Is it going to be affective? Where are you going to place grit if you do a study with L2 grit as a predictor? And which effect size guideline will you use? That is entirely going to be up to the researcher, because I don't have an answer for you. It will depend on how you define it. And then, of course, in ours, we have outcome variables such as academic achievement and L2 proficiency. So that mix up of a proficiency and a proxy is also going to influence it, because you will likely find larger effect sizes with proxies of proficiencies like academic achievement than you will with an actual objective proficiency measure, which is a different paper that we're presenting hopefully at Euro SLA. But anyway, okay. And then the effect size guidelines is still a subjective judgment. But we argue that even if this is a subjective judgment, as long as you can say, these are the guidelines that I follow, this is the interpretation I use, and this is why I use it, and you basically support your judgment, that is already going a long way towards adding some more depth to the way we do things instead of just reporting a p-value and interpreting a p-value. So the third point that I want to make as well is that effect sizes, small effect sizes, are not unimportant effect sizes. And to illustrate this, I would highly recommend the paper from Richard et al. It was published in 2003, so years ago. But what they did is they had a look at effect sizes found in psychology that have become almost a truth in research and a truth in the way we do things. And they had a look at what was the actual effect sizes found for studies that looked at this. So, for example, scarcity increases the value of a commodity. We build entire economies based on this. And the effect size that they found was 0.12, which by any measure is incredibly small. And a second one is students achieve more if teachers interact with them, display warmth, and give positive feedback. We have built entire education systems around this principle. And yet the effect size found is 0.24. Very small. And people who have high achievement motivation achieve more. A fundamental belief of many, many people has an effect size of 0.18. And no one will tell you that any of these truths are unimportant or are not used in day-to-day education policy reform. And yet the effect sizes are quite small. So people should not be discouraged by smaller effect sizes. I very much like the quote from Funder and Elouise that said that small effect sizes are not merely worth taking seriously, they are also more believable. And as part of this emphasis on effect sizes, we have to be very careful that we not then say the only effect sizes that are worth listening to are large ones, because that is also very much not true. And then effect size guidelines are not commandments. So at no point is it that you have to follow the effect size guidelines that I tell you today. I'll never insist on that, because there is various contexts that will always have an influence. Because we have to take into consideration things like age, gender, culture, linguistic distance. All of these things have been found to influence the relationship between an individual differences predictor and a language learning outcome variable. So when you interpret your effect sizes, it is also important to take the broader context of your study into account. And if it is a smaller effect size than you were expecting, or a larger one, to consider to what extent the context had an influence on this. And then, of course, the second thing that will always matter in terms of context is the specificity matching principle. Because the more specific your variables are, the larger your effect sizes tend to be. So, for example, if you measure L2 motivation as a predictor of L2 academic achievement, you will have a larger effect size than if you measure personality as a predictor of L2 academic achievement, because your L2 motivation and your L2 outcome variable is on the same level. The context matches. It is at the same level of specificity. But a personality variable is up there as a broad, vague construct. And you are now taking this broad, vague construct and you're linking it to a very specific outcome. So, of course, your effect sizes are going to be smaller. And that's always something to take into account. And for us, that also comes into play with things like our domain specificity. So if you are using grades from a different context, so let's say you're comparing grades with maths and language learning, those domains means that the specificity is not necessarily matching. So it's going to affect the way you interpret things. And then effect size guidelines are not a crutch for weak designs. And this I highly want to emphasize and also link to the work of Luc Plonsky on the methodological reforms. Because the validity of our effect sizes and the way we interpret it is 100% based on the way we designed the study, collected the data, used our methods. If all of those steps beforehand are not correct, our effect sizes are uninterpretable and basically meaningless. So the findings of statistically significant effect sizes are only worthwhile if a rigorous scientific process was followed. And I mean, it's very easy to say, yes, okay, but if you follow a scientific process that's not necessarily that good, you have some measurement error in there, it's fine because your p-value is still going to tell you if this was significant or not. But that is not true because we always have spurious correlations. So I don't know if you know the website Spurious Correlations, but it's a lot of fun to have a look at. If you are ever bored, go have a look at that. And from there, we can look at something like what is the correlation between the degrees in linguistics awarded in the USA correlated with milk consumption. So something that obviously is completely unrelated. And it has a correlation of 0.984. So almost 1. And of course, no one is ever going to argue that one influenced the other. But if you look at the chart, it looks like one influenced the other. And it is the same with degrees in linguistics awarded in the USA and the amount of nuclear power generated in Germany. Almost a 1. And no one is going to tell you that because we awarded less degrees in linguistics in the USA, suddenly Germany doesn't want to use nuclear power anymore. That's not an argument. And these are absolutely ridiculous examples, but we have to be aware of spurious correlations in our own work that rests upon the assumption that our hypotheses, our literature review was not done sufficiently, the way we used our methods, the way we collected data, etc. All of that can influence our results. And then in essence, an effect size guideline means nothing. So yeah. Then, of course, the limitations of the study, there are quite a lot. So also, when you use our effect size guidelines, please keep these in mind. We have significant publication bias, and that is likely skewing things. Measurement error was not taken into account, and of course, there will be measurement error. Then it is the possibility that the list of meta-analyses we used is not exhaustive. I think from when we collected data to now, a few extra meta-analyses have even been published. And of course, we have those that did not report everything we needed that were not included. We also used a very specific taxonomy of individual differences that, like I said, will not necessarily capture all of the individual differences variables that we used, like, for example, crit. And then we have in our outcome variables both proficiencies and proxies of proficiencies. That is going to skew things. Okay. Then the conclusion is very basic. Please report and interpret your effect sizes. And you don't have to use my guidelines, but please use someone's guidelines. And then if you wanted to read the preprint, you can scan it or you can follow this link. We hope to have it in circulation soon. So yeah, and then that is it. So questions, comments, etc. is welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elouise, for this great and insightful talk. We will now open the floor for questions from the audience. And by the way, we are honored by the presence of Joe Mark as well, Abdullah Al-Amir, and all the scholars with us today. And of course, that they will have something to say. Yes, the floor is yours. Anyone has any question? Yes, Joe Mark, yes.
I have a question. I think it would be good for you to present these findings at editors' meeting, say at AAAL. I think that, because as you say, that not all journals include that requirement. I think the source would really be to convince editors that for whatever quantitative study, there should be this expectation. And I think that it would help if you talked to them. And of course, a lot of them will be sympathetic to you because Luke Plonsky is an editor of a major journal and so many others. But I think that they would probably welcome your input and your views on this. So you might even think about organizing a panel at a future AAAL conference to present this, and then the invitation can be spread on the editors list to all editors present at the conference. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, that's a nice suggestion. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think for Luke, it'll be like preaching to the choir, because I think his journal is one of the very few that specifically have a policy about effect sizes. So yeah, but I think, yeah, he'll probably agree.
But I think you would help him.
Yes.
He cannot tell his fellow editors, this is what you should be doing. If you
that's true.
it, and you're not an editor, then you are unbiased in that way.
Yeah, because I think it's definitely needed. I mean, it's not to say that, because I think reviewers police it a lot in between themselves. I've seen a lot with reviews that I've written, that I asked, that I already saw that the other reviewers also asked for the effect sizes to be interpreted. I've seen in the past with my papers where I forgot to say whose guidelines I used, a reviewer very quickly asked, whose guidelines are you using? So I think it is a little bit policed in terms of the people who often work with quantitative research, but we have to have a policy about it. I'm very much in favor of rather having it in black and white on the policy of the journal than relying solely on reviewers to know that they should look for that. Yeah, but that's a nice suggestion. Thank you. Hi, Abdullah.
Hi, Elouise. Wow, what a brilliant presentation. The effect size
Thank
is
you.
large. P-value is 0.001.
Yes.
That's brilliant. I like it so much. And it's so the idea of splitting or categorizing the effect sizes according to the fields is brilliant. I think that I saw the difference from personality subfield with something like cognitive. The difference is
Yes.
huge. So that's, yeah,
It's
that makes
enormous.
sense to the
Yeah.
authors and researchers when they get like a correlation of 0.20 in personality, then they should be okay. They
Yes.
should
Yeah.
not
Be
feel
happy
like,
about it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I have just a couple of questions, but the first one is a bit technical. When you said the variance explained by the large effect size was 28%, why
Yeah.
is that? Do you have an explanation why the large
Oh,
effect
we
size
just
only explained 28?
we very simply just looked at the R square as the variance explained. So it's a very simple, just R from R square calculation, which is an oversimplification, a massive one. So, but I usually use it to explain to my students as well what I mean with variance explained.
Yeah. So when someone get like a large effect size, it means in a way or another that we have large things left for other variables to predict other than,
Still, yes, even if it is a
yeah.
large effect size, because I mean, if you have a correlation of 0.7, I can't do that type of maths in my head, but maybe someone else can, like 0.7, and you take the square of it, so you make a square of it, that's not necessarily going to be larger, like an enormous variance explained, because that's just what we did with ours. So we just took a effect size of 0.7 and we say, okay, this is the R. What is the R square of it? Okay, this is how we look at variance explained.
Yeah, cool. Another thing that came to my mind when you start talking about the categorizing the effect sizes, which is brilliant again, I was also thinking about differentiate the effect sizes between observational data and experimental data. I
Yes.
think this is going to
Yes.
be very beneficial to the field because when we do
Yes.
experiment, then we expect smaller effect size in psychology in general
Exactly.
and language learning. So we wouldn't expect something like 0.50 from an experiment.
No, no, never.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. So I think if we have something in future about comparing the effect sizes, whether in test of variance, like ANOVA, MANOVA, or even correlation, you can absolutely do
Yes.
experiment with correlation. So maybe we can have something in future about experiment
Yes.
versus observational. What do you think?
Yes, because to me, like when we went through the list of meta-analyses, there are a lot of meta-analyses that look at things like interventions, that look at things like experiments. And then, of course, they use things like Cohen's d to have a look at the actual effects. And we excluded all of those meta-analyses because we only included correlation coefficients, we only included cross-sectional work. But there is a massive gap in the field, and it would actually be quite easy to do exactly this. So to use the methods of Ginac and Cesar and to have a look at the effect sizes found for interventions in the field or experimental work in the field, and to give effect size guidelines for things like Cohen's d, because we don't have that. You do have, I mean, but it's a very rough conversion that you can do between like an R to a Cohen's d or an R to a beta or something. And I have seen some guidelines that say you can use, for example, the guidelines of an R to interpret a standardized beta. But to me, that is a bit roughshod, and it's not something that we should attempt to do. But this type of work where we do a second order synthesis and we use it for exactly what you said, an intervention or experimental study, would, I think, help a lot, because I think at the moment those researchers who are using interventions and experiments do not have a sufficient effect size guideline for our field.
So what is your suggestion for now?
Yeah, I mean,
for
why
those who
not?
are doing interventions?
Oh, it's the people who are currently doing it. I mean, good luck, because when I looked at the work on how to convert it, because we got a comment from a reviewer as well that asked, okay, you give effect size guidelines for R's, but what if I'm currently doing a study that uses Cohen's d? What do I do? And I had a look, and there are some chatter on the statistical blogs and things like that, where people say, okay, but you could technically use, for example, Cohen's R recommendations, etc. And you do find some recommendations by other people regarding what is small, medium, and large. But all of those recommendations are from psychology. I couldn't find one except for Plonsky and Oswald. Plonsky and Oswald do have a Cohen's D recommendation. They don't have a beta, but they have a Cohen's D recommendation. And those are the only ones that you currently have. But again, the Plonsky and Oswald one does include all meta-analysis. So it's not necessarily going to look at intervention studies that look at things like individual differences.
Great. The last thing I have here is I think we, I think we should look at how the effect sizes have been obtained from. I think meta-analysis usually use correlations from bivariate correlation.
Yes,
Usually,
always, yeah. Usually
because we
bivariate,
have correlation. I mean, we can have like correlation from factor analysis, like CFA. When you have two factors, then the correlation would be different if you do a correlation between the same two factors in bivariate correlation, having the mean value of the two.
Yes,
So
your
the
latent
correlation
and
will be-
manifest, will be different,
And will be different if you use like ECM, the explanatory structure
Yes.
equation modeling. The correlation will be way smaller
Yeah.
because of the cross loadings. So I think this something is going to be an interesting direction for interpreting the effect sizes and correlation. Actually, we have a paper. It's not a meta-analysis or anything, just from one data set, we used bivariate correlation, CFA, and ECM, and we have three different effect sizes from the same sample.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens all the time because we have in our personality paper, we specifically looked at a correlation first, then a manifest regression, and then a latent regression. And every time it changes and things are different in terms of the significance, they're different in terms of the effect size. So that's also a bit of a worry because then as a researcher, technically, if someone wanted to, they could just choose the method that gives them the nicest answer, which is not necessarily what we want when we talk about methodological reform.
Yeah. So currently the effect sizes are generated from bivariate correlation, right?
Yes. So, I mean, we are sort of relying on everyone who did a meta-analysis that they did a good job because we are using the meta work. But the majority of them did specify, did specify that it is bivariate correlations. It is here and there that it is not specified. So, I mean, that comes part of the error. So it for us is just an error that is sort of already subsumed into the work. If you wanted to overcome that, I think you would have to go back to the original effect sizes and the original work. And we had a look about that. We thought about it because we thought about perhaps coding the reliabilities, but the majority of the meta-analysis didn't code the reliabilities. And to go back and say, okay, we go from 23 meta-analyses to no, we're going to go to about 2,000 original published works and recode them all separately was, to be honest, a bit much. So we didn't do it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Brilliant.
Oh, and thank you for the link as well. I'm definitely going to have a look. Okay, any other questions or comments? Always happy to chat. I'll take the silence as a good thing.
Thank you very much, Elouise, for this interesting talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I have a question for you. It's about like effect size in small sample studies. So like in many studies, the sample size it can be small. And so what recommendations would you give for interpreting and reporting effect sizes in such cases, like when the sample size is small? So does that affect samples? I mean, does sample size affect how we report the effect size?
Okay, so that, I mean, that's a bit complicated because your sample size is going to affect it in terms of your method used might not be correct for the sample size that you have. So if you have a sample size that is too small and you're using something like structural equation modeling, in the end, it doesn't matter what your effect size is or your p-value because your sample size is not sufficient and you don't have sufficient power. So to me, when it comes to sample size, it will be more a question of, is my sample size sufficient for the method that I want to use? Do I have this statistical power to do this? If yes, then you interpret the effect size as it is, because then you have done your homework. It is correct. If you say no, then you have to go back to the drawing board and choose a different method, because again, your effect size interpretation is dependent on you doing all of the steps before that correctly. But of course, your sample size will in essence influence things like your p-value and your effect size to some extent, but it's a lot less intense than it is with the p-value. So for me, it would always be a bit more, make sure that all your boxes are checked before it comes to interpreting the effect size. But it's a nice question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Louise, I have a question as well. Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate you for this amazing talk. You know, I thought I knew something about and SPSS, but I see it seems I don't know that much.
No. I mean, this is very simple methods. It's literally just descriptive.
It would be great for you to actually give us some, you know, workshops on, you know, such sophisticated things that you do. My
I'd be
question
happy to.
it would be amazing. I would definitely attend them. So, Louise, I wanted to ask you about because you talked about effect sizes according to different, you know, categories, and you talked about this the fact that it was much higher when you about cognitive differences, about motivation, and I found that so interesting. So I was wondering, what do you think about that? You know, do you think that it's actually higher? You know, I mean, is there a higher impact, or do you interpret it as? Do you interpret it as just, you know, because it's motivation that explains the higher correlation, right, or the higher effect size? Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question, and that actually goes back. So if you have a look at the way that the effect sizes are distributed when it comes to the cognitive differences, the one caveat we have there is that it's a bimodal distribution. So when it is there, it makes one bump, it comes down again, and it makes a second bump. And what that means is that in the data, it might be that we have a grouping problem, that the way we group things as cognitive is not correct, and it should actually rather be two different separate categories, which I think is actually what's going on, but okay. But also we can say that in the field itself then, we actually have one normal distribution where we will find smaller effect sizes, and we have another normal distribution that we find larger effect sizes. And my answer for this is purely based on the research that I've done in the past. It's not like statistical or whatever. But in the past, we have had studies where we look at ideal L2 self, for example, and those types of motivations. And we do find quite large effect sizes when it comes to ideal L2 self and outcome variables, where with things like self-efficacy, it's a little bit smaller. And I don't know if it's the way we capture things, if it's the way the variables are worded when it comes to ideal L2 self, especially if it's linked to things like self-perceived proficiency. It seems to be very strong. And I mean, I know that Ali has made an argument in the past that ideal L2 self is also a version of your self-perceived proficiency. So that's why the correlation might be quite high, is the way that we measure it. What would be interesting is to look at motivation not in the ideal L2 self, so not in the L2 motivational system, and to look at the effect sizes of that type of motivation versus the ideal L2 self motivation versus self-efficacy. But in our paper, we also made it clear that if you have cognitive differences, use our guidelines with a little bit of sensitivity, because it is likely that your guideline might not, or your effect size might not fall on the second bump that it made in the distribution, but on the first bump. And that then, even if you say, okay, I have an effect size of 0.3, in our guidelines, it's going to be quite small. But it might be that for self-efficacy, this is actually an effective guide, like this is a large or a medium effect size. And to look at that, there's no other way but to look at the previous research that has been done in your field, like for example, self-efficacy, and say, okay, but the previous 5 papers have found this effect size. My effect size is in line with this effect size, or my effect size is different. So unfortunately, with effect size guidelines, it's always going to be super subjective. And the way you interpret it is 100% going to depend on how deep you want to go into interpreting it, into finding what other people, looking at what other people have found, or just using a simple guideline. But yeah, that's a very big caveat for the cognitive differences that has to be highlighted. Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a nice question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, and also with cognitive, what I want to also emphasize is the fact that we included willingness to communicate there is also maybe skewing things, but yes. So yeah. Any other questions or comments? My slides are also available, so if you want them, please just send me an email and I can share them with you happily.
That would be lovely, Louise. We really need to watch this again and actually sit down and take notes and study, you know, learn them. It's really nice.
Yeah,
You're more than welcome.
Yeah, and this talk will be made available on YouTube, because we have created a YouTube channel to share all the online events for those who missed it or would like to rewatch the talk.
Thank you. Yes, we linked to your YouTube page in our newsletter, so it's great. We keep advertising it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Anna, I interrupted you.
Yeah, okay, it's all right. Just to advertise the paper as well, where do you plan to publish it?
It's currently under the second round of review at Learning and Individual Differences, and we're hoping it comes out before summer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, fingers crossed. I mean, the reviewers have to look at it again, but yes. Okay. If there are no more questions, if anyone is shy and you don't want to ask a question in the group, you can also just email me. I honestly don't mind. And then, of course, if you want to have the slides, also just send me an email.
Thank you so much, Louise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so
It's a
much,
pleasure.
Elouise, for your great and amazing talk. And I'm sure that this is the kind of talks that everyone will benefit from immediately. Thank you so much, and we hope to host you again in future.
Thank you, and also thank you so much for inviting me. It was really fun. It
Thank you.
always is in the SIGs. So yes, and thank you for all the nice questions and discussions. And I hope we can have more discussions next year in China at the PLL.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
would be
sure.
amazing. Yeah. Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, you too. Bye.
Bye.